Okay, so my name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Red Scholar's virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you'll be hearing from Dr. Matthew Palczynski. Matt holds a Ph.D. in art history from the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. Matt is a historian and consultant who believes that art-related experiences can teach us a lot about ourselves and the world around us. He's based in Palo Alto, as you can see, and he has given hundreds of lectures at museums, universities, and organizations around the world. His most recent upcoming talks include those for Stanford, Microsoft, the Wharton School, and the Barnes Foundation. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Matt.
Thanks, Matt. First, I hope you are all well, wherever you are. If you are at home, if you are at a friend's house, home of a loved one, wherever you are in the country, wherever you are in the world, I send my best to you. I'm here with you, and this is one of the reasons that I am really happy to do this, to jump in. Ordinarily, I'd be lecturing around, but here we are, and I am thrilled that Rhodes Scholar is doing this. This is one of a whole raft of lectures that they've been able to put together very, very quickly. So extremely impressive. So let's sit back. We have about 30 minutes to learn about one of the most intriguing people in the history of art, certainly, and the history of the world, and that would be Pablo Picasso. My first question to you is, do you have a middle name? And do you have as many middle names as this guy? Read these with me together at the bottom. Pretty amazing. Here we can see some of the names. Diego, after his paternal grandfather and eldest uncle. Jose, that's his father. References to maternal grandfather, cousins, even the shoemaker saints, whose feast day falls on October 25th, his birthday. So lots of names here with Picasso, and you might wonder whether or not this is typical or whether or not there was something very special about this baby. And indeed, the story is quite intriguing. When Picasso was born, 1881, and I want you to keep that name in the back of your head, because in the early years, we'll see how young, in fact, he is. So store that date, sorry, not name, date somewhere, 1881. Picasso was born at such small, low birth weight that he was pronounced a stillborn. And so the stories go, was left on a table in the birthing room. And Picasso's uncle, Salvador, a figure who plays a pretty big role in his early year, a figure that Picasso credits so much of his early development to, was in the delivery room as well. And so the story goes, was smoking a cigar, as 1881 delivery rooms apparently went. And the boy was lying over on the table, pronounced a stillborn, and Uncle Salvador goes over to the boy, Picasso, and blows cigar smoke in his face, apparently. And this is the moment that Picasso comes to life. So he's got this in his mind, and these stories of his difficult birth are told over and over and over in his childhood and after. And it's something that Picasso liked to share with his friends. It's as if he cheated death. He certainly felt like he had. He said once, doctors used to smoke big cigars, and my uncle was no exception. When he saw me lying there, he blew smoke into my face. I immediately reacted with a grimace and a bellow of fury. First male heir on both sides of the family here, a difficult birth. And it's pretty clear by the time he's 12 years old that he's able to do something pretty miraculous. Now, there are terms that we use, that you use, that I use to talk about people like this. People like Mozart, who had this uncanny ability to do what he could do at age 5 and 6 and get sent around the courts in Europe. That's extraordinary. And this is certainly true of Picasso. And some of the terms that we use to describe people like this, terms like genius or terms like prodigy, they certainly fit here. Think of the 12-year-old people that you know. Was he a prodigy? No doubt. Here we are looking at an image by Picasso at a very young age. Remember, 1881 was his birth year. He was born in Malaga, Spain. His father was an art instructor at a provincial school there. 10 years later, in 1891, the family moves to Corunna, also in Spain, where his father, the painter, becomes a professor of Gertrude School of Art there. And you can imagine that the young boy with these extraordinary talents was sketching at home, sketching in his father's studio, encouraged by his father. It doesn't always work that way. If your parent is one type of artist that you might have a child like this, it doesn't always go this way. So he's got the gift and he's got the environment that allowed it. So again, 1895 here, 13 to 14 years old. At the right, you're looking at a detail of a painting in full view at the left. January 1895, when Picasso's 13, his sister Conchita dies of diphtheria. She's 7 years old. The family leaves Corunna for Barcelona, which would have been a place where certainly more access to the world of art, more access to the academies for his father and for him. So that makes sense. Along the way, they stop back in Malaga, and it's there that he paints this, the portrait of Salmeron. The subject is not a complicated one here. Salmeron is a fisherman. These are paintings that were meant to be part of the tourist trade. I've picked up works of art like this and objects of curiosity. I'm sure you have too. Not necessarily museum quality, perhaps, but meant to be sent home with tourists in that region. This is a very good one, though. Most of the time during his stay in Malaga, on this little break on the way to Barcelona, Uncle Salvador again plays a big role. Salvador hired Salmeron, and with the hope, so the stories go, that this would keep Picasso busy for the duration of his time in Malaga. And Salvador got very frustrated, and Picasso loved to tell the story, because Salmeron was finished after a day. Picasso could paint this quickly. Whether or not it was a day or a bit longer, we don't know. But the story is bracketed around the reality that this young boy, 13, could paint like this very, very quickly. And as Picasso said, it caused Uncle Salvador a lot of consternation. It cost him more money, certainly, to go get another model. But he, like everyone else, couldn't really keep up with him. So he gets a little bit of time in his hometown, and then, of course, off to Barcelona. But think about this, 13 years old. Think of the people that you know that are that age, and put into the mix the death of his sister, age 7. And here we are. He then leaves the place where he lives and is off to Barcelona. There's so much happening in his world and in his mind. There's no one way to say this is why Picasso paints this way, but certainly that's a lot of experience for a young boy, a young person. And it no doubt allowed him the ability to really read people. Look at this figure here. You get a sense that this is not just brown paint and white paint and gray paint. This is a person, and this is a person with an interiority. This is a person with psychology. I can't do this in paint. I don't know if you can. I certainly can't make something two-dimensional look alive like this. It's really quite extraordinary. Father then goes off to Barcelona, takes his job there, and convinces the school to let his young, prodigious 13-year-old boy take the entrance exam for the art school. It's supposed to take a month. It took Picasso 1 week to finish. Here at the right around the same time, man in a beret, 13 to 14 years old. Not extraordinary, not the best painting that he's ever done, but he's 13 years old. And here, on the way to Malaga and ultimately to Barcelona, the family stops in Madrid. Those of you who have been to Madrid know what a wonderful city that is. And if you've been to the Prado Museum there, you probably know how important it is. It's Spain's Louvre. It's loaded with treasures, including 63 works by Velazquez. You see at the left, a portrait of a man. Velazquez was 64 when he painted this, and Picasso was 13. So one of these two has been at this a long, long time and has perfected his craft, but one is looking very closely at the other one. Of course, Velazquez, the great Spanish painter, would be in the back of Picasso's mind. This is someone to beat. This is someone to learn from. This is someone to think about. Notice the similarities of how the face is positioned, some of the background blanking out there. Again, the sense that these are real people and not just people on canvas. This begins a very long history with the Prado Museum. Of course, he falls in love with it at age 13, and then many, many years later, 1937, received the position of honorary director there. So really coming full circle from the wide-eyed boy stopping there on the way to Barcelona to see these things for the first time to finally becoming its director, and what a life he had. 1415, take a look at this photo at the right. We forget how young he is. This is a boy. This is someone who is young, and this is a photo that reminds us of where he is at this time. At the left, 1896, First Communion. This is a moment for Picasso where he's starting to play more, where he's starting to experiment more with the rules, with how things are supposed to look, what the iconography is, meaning the objects in the image, what they are meant to represent. He becomes quite poetic here. Here we see a boy on the altar, and the face of that boy, if you compare it to the photo, is very similar. So there is a strong suggestion that here Picasso is showing you a self-portrait, and he's up on the altar. He gives himself even more privilege. He's positioned in front of his sister, obviously not Conchita, but his other sister Lola, while she's receiving First Communion. And notice on the altar the candelabra with 4 candles. 2 are not lit. That would represent the first sister who died, and then another child, Jose, who died in infancy. And of course, the 2 lit candles there for the 2 people present, Picasso and his sister Lola. Extraordinary gift at this age to think poetically about who lives, who dies, how to represent images of Catholicism and so on. By about 1898, Picasso gets scarlet fever. He leaves Madrid, where he's studying at the best art school in the country after his time at the Barcelona school. So again, imagine someone at this age who runs through the school, finishes it up, and then is so good that he has to go off to the best school in the country, which is what he did in Madrid. But by 98, he gets scarlet fever and leaves Madrid to come back to Barcelona. A bit of background there. 2 years later, in 1900, he takes his first trip to Paris. And the reason behind this is that he's come to see the World's Fair, and he stays a good chunk of the fall, September to December. Picasso knows that in Spain, he only has so much access. He's already finished the Barcelona Academy, he's already finished the Madrid Academy, and the only other place to go if you, in those days, are trying to be in the thick of it, in the middle of the world of art, is Paris. There are lots of other art capitals, London, throughout Germany, the US, elsewhere around the world. But there's something very unique about Paris in 1900. It truly is the epicenter of a kind of modernist innovation, a kind of celebration of the life of Paris. Of course, Paris is all abuzz in 1900 with a celebration of bohemianism. At the left, here's Toulouse-Lautrec, Moulin de la Galette. You see lots of these images from the late 19th century in the modern circles in Paris, images of these café-concerts, these places where the rich, the poor, the middle, everyone, the eccentrics, the artists, the bourgeoisie, the aristocrats, they all came together. Moulin Rouge is another example. Toulouse-Lautrec was someone who very much celebrated these underground, artistic, bohemian nightclubs. Picasso now gets to see these for the first time. And at the right, with his own Moulin de la Galette, he's 18, 19 here, 19. He shows you his own version. Look at the nightlife. Look at the dancing, the cordiality, the faces, even that green tint over all the faces. A bit of a reference to absinthe, probably the drink of choice that night at the Moulin de la Galette. It opens his world. He's never really seen anything like this, and he's been around in Barcelona. Picasso goes to Paris with his good buddy from Barcelona, Carlos Casagemas, and here at the left, a photo with Picasso and Casagemas and another figure who was a compatriot of theirs at that time. He goes to Paris with Casagemas and he stays with him. Casagemas was a Catalan painter, poet, friend from way back, the son of an American consul general in Barcelona. They met in 1899. So he's got a partner in crime here. He's got someone who speaks his language, not only artistically, but also literally. He's in a whole different world here. This is a moment for Picasso that he's seeing new things and he's learning new things and he's running through the Louvre and copying and ingratiating himself on into the wonderful world of the Parisian avant-garde. And it's in this moment that Picasso makes this self-portrait, Yo Picasso, 1901, confident, tan, full of life, full of vigor. This is a very good place for him. Handsome, young. Casagemas was 1 year older. Picasso's 2021, so they're young and they're in Paris having a good time. The combination of the two, Picasso the prodigy, Casagemas the well-connected figure, was really made for quite an interesting little duo. This confidence for him, this ability now that he's seen all that there is to see in Paris, gave him the confidence to finally break free from his father. Now you can imagine this. Your father is a painter and so are you. And how long will you go on knowing that you're better? How long will you listen to the instruction of your father when you know you don't have to? And how awkward that must be as the child in that relationship to have to make a break, have to say, no, I don't see it that way. I see it this way. And he's done this at a very young age. But in 1901, given all this newfound Parisian confidence, he finally does make that break. And he titles this painting with the defiant inscription, I, Picasso. His father knew what that meant, and Picasso knew what that meant. This is a denial of Picasso's father's better name, Ruiz, a name that would have been recognized as such. And this is an embrace of his mother's name, Picasso. So really, this is quite strong territory here. 1891 to 95, his father was professor at the School of Fine Arts in Corona, and then, as I said, into Barcelona and onward. And this is a moment for Picasso that he's recognizing that he's moved beyond that. Oh, I got the title wrong on the left. Sorry about that. Here we're looking at the picture of Picasso done in the same year, 1901. Do you notice how different these are? At the right, very colorful, very confident, even the way he turns around to greet you like a person in the middle of a performance. At the left, we don't see any of this. The big cloak that he wears, the blue background, the gray tone in his face is so different in the same year. So what accounts for this? Clearly, Picasso's confidence won't last long. First of all, he wonders whether or not he's contracted syphilis. In 1900, that is a death sentence. And this is something that's very much on his mind because he knows that he's frequented the brothels of Barcelona and elsewhere. We know now he was treated for venereal disease in Barcelona. So this is something that's causing him a good deal of anxiety. But there's another reason that the pictures suddenly change, that at the left, we see this sort of melancholic, brooding sort of image. Around this time, he and Casagemas have a falling out, and Picasso and Casagemas had traveled together to Paris. And then toward the end of the year, toward the end of their time there, 1900, Picasso takes Casagemas with him back home to Spain. First, they go to Barcelona for Christmas in 1900, and then they go on to Picasso's hometown of Malaga for New Year's. We don't know what happened, but something happened there just about arriving in the hometown in Malaga that really just changed Picasso's view of Casagemas. We don't speculate, we don't know. But Picasso then really turned around and put Casagemas on a boat back to Barcelona immediately. And this ends their friendship. This is his only close friend in Paris. So this is quite a big deal. Picasso will stay in Spain until May. Casagemas goes back to Paris through Barcelona. And then the story gets tragic. February 17th in Paris, Casagemas arranges for a farewell dinner, and he asks a model that he's very, very enamored by, Germaine. She's known as Germaine in the history books about Picasso. He asks her at this dinner party to marry him, professes his love for her. He's done this before, probably, and again, she refuses, and he pulls out a pistol and he shoots at her. She didn't actually get shot, but she falls down. This is very odd, very strange for everyone. And in that second of mayhem and chaos, realizes that he may have just shot the love of his life. Remember, she fell down, probably from shock. And so Casagemas turns the pistol on himself and commits suicide in front of everyone there at that farewell dinner. This is February 17th. Picasso will remain in Spain until May. So he's dealing with this initially from afar, and then after that in his pictorial works here. This is unapologetic. Look at the tone of the face. Look at the scar on the right temple from his wound. At the right, the candle. There has been some reference to this being a Ionic symbol related to Germaine, love, which ultimately did him in, but we don't know. It's certainly a very tragic painting. Picasso's still thinking about this for a while. This launches what historians like to call his blue period. Blue because of the tones he uses, but blue because of the melancholia that's totally taken over him as a result of this. He's already lost his sister when he was a young boy. Now he's lost his best friend, and he's not that old yet. May 1901, he returns to Paris, goes back to stay at the apartment that they share together in Paris, and begins to have an affair with Germaine, the love of Casagemas's life. Now, this is anecdotal, but what biographers mention about Picasso is that one of the reasons Germaine wasn't that into Casagemas is that he probably had some sexual difficulties performing sexually. And so this is something that has not been true of Picasso and certainly will not be true of Picasso throughout his life. And so it's a double whammy here to move back and then to take on a love affair of the woman with whom Casagemas was so infatuated. But it's still very much on his mind, the death of his best friend. Here in The Burial of Casagemas, 1901, at the bottom, there he is lying in state, as it were. And then if your eyes wander up to the top, you get a sense of how Casagemas's spirit is apotheosized, is transmitted to the clouds. It's gone away from his body. And up there in this realm, this celestial realm at the far left, the spirit of Casagemas meets three graces, but they're dressed a bit more like women that would be at the brothels Casagemas and Picasso frequented. So he's honoring him and he's dealing with this loss, but he's also playing fast and loose with something that did Casagemas in, really, his inabilities. The blue period continues for a while. At the left, La Vie again. Casagemas still very much on his mind. The figure at the left, the nude female, most likely Germaine. And something interesting happens at the left in La Vie. The figure to whom Germaine clutches, when you look at that figure under X-ray, it becomes clear that Picasso plays with that figure. At one point it's Picasso, at one point it's Casagemas. So it's still very, very much on his mind. Until around 03, 04, 05. It's on his mind, but he moves into a different phase. Perhaps at this point he realizes he doesn't have syphilis. It's now been 4 years. And he moves on into what we call the rose period. So we move from blue tones to pink and rose tones at the right. Notice some of the similarities with the composition, how the figures go from the bottom of the canvas where those toes are at the left, all the way up to the hair, to the top of the figure. That same verticality, that same elongation we see at the right. It's as if those blue figures just walked right into a different backdrop, one full of much more color, but one still ultimately very strange, netherworld that we can't put our finger on. Figure at the left in Saltimbanques is Picasso. He's dressed as a court jester, the Saltimbanque, a figure he loved because the court jester, the traveling circus figure is someone that Picasso identified with. He didn't want the bourgeois life. He didn't want the picket fence. He didn't want this. He liked being the pack up and move on circus figure. Notice that he holds that circus figure, the hand of a little girl. Now I know exactly who that little girl is. That is 7-year-old sister. Picasso, ever trying to find his way here, very tender, very gentle. He's 22 years old. He said that the little figure there is the daughter of the concierge where he worked. And he mentioned her once that she used to play hopscotch and skip outside his window. And he said, it was so sweet, I never wanted her to grow up. And so clearly Picasso was revealing here, this little girl playing outside, it's more about his sister and perhaps the feelings that he has about her. This is one of his great paintings, massive thing, 83 by 90 inches, took him 9 months to complete. He's working his way out of the blue period. And then something very interesting happens. 1905, he meets the Americans Gertrude and Leo Stein. Here at the left, Man Ray's portrait of Gertrude Stein next to the Picasso portrait in 1922. The Steins were wealthy. They come from a wealthy textile clothing family in Baltimore. And by the early part of the decade, they've set up shop in Paris as expatriates, and they are, through their salon in Paris, welcoming artists and other people to the mix. Picasso becomes very taken by her, becomes very taken by her connections, very taken by the other artists that he meets through the Steins. And in 1906, not right around the time that the Steins introduced Picasso to Matisse, he paints her portrait, Gertrude Stein, at the right. Doesn't look exactly like her. She will mention this to him when he's finished, and he said, don't worry about it, it'll look like you one day. Doesn't have to look like you now, it'll look like you one day. And it's such an interesting comment because it reminds us that for Picasso, it wasn't about Gertrude Stein here. For Picasso, it was about how he moves his art forward, how he continues to grow. There will be some artists that happen upon a style and keep it throughout their whole careers. And there will be others like Picasso that master, let's say, a math equation and are ready to move on. They figured it out. Blue period done, rose period done, on to something else. And it didn't matter who sat in front of him. It was Picasso working out a new style. Here we're looking at one of the great photos of the period, I think, the collection of Leo and Gertrude Stein in the studio. You can see Picasso's picture, there's a Matisse there. This is some of the great work of the period there in the home of Gertrude Stein. Gertrude and Leo. One of the things very much on Picasso's mind here by about 1905 is a kind of art that he's not that familiar with, a kind of art that doesn't come from anything that he studied. African masks, Iberian masks. He wouldn't have seen things like this at the left in proper museums in those days. In those days, things like this, objects like this that have come out of Africa, etc., were in what was called ethnographic museums. They weren't quite there yet. Now, of course, we would find these in proper art museums. These at the left are not the objects that Picasso looked at especially, but I bring this in because this is a wonderful photo from an exhibition in Vienna in 2017 that paired African Oceanic art with the art of Picasso, etc., during this moment of great interest in this kind of work. Imagine if you had never seen anything like this at the left and suddenly it's in ethnographic museums and you could go see it. It would be remarkable. And so Picasso spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to incorporate the style of the masks into classic Western European painting. At the right, do you notice how sharp her features are? The nose, the very pointy, the mouth, just one line, the eyes, very emphasized in terms of the almond shape, the strict brow, and so on. That's the result of Picasso trying to incorporate the aesthetic from the works like those you see at the left, very stylized, very geometric, very basic. Not the European legacy that he's looking at, but now a very different one. He believed that these objects held all kinds of magic and power and so on. And he wants to make a hybrid, as it were, of masks on the one hand and then traditional portraiture on the other hand. In February, I had the opportunity to give 14 lectures in the South Pacific with Rhodes Scholar, and we saw so many of these objects from what we would call Oceania, kind of objects that are just so different. And you can imagine how Picasso was very taken by this. When we think about this, I don't want you to be thinking of primitive, but that's a very inappropriate term. It's not very nice. We don't want to think that there's any hierarchy. But for Picasso, truly, that's part of how he's reading these figures. And we want to use the definition by, say, Maurice Merleau-Ponty of primitive, a fundamental aboriginal understanding of the world, meaning, do those masks represent people that are different, that are able to connect to something beyond me? That's what he believes he's doing. He's not studying the masks per se and anthropologically, sociologically figuring out what they're about. He's just copying them from this understanding that those masks are born out of a people that seem to know more. And so next time when we meet in 2 weeks, we'll begin there again with Gertrude Stein in 2006, the result of painting the portrait 90 times, 90. Can you imagine sitting 90 times her portrait? And at the end of it, as I said, Gertrude Stein sees something that really doesn't look like her, that isn't really about her. It's about Picasso wrestling with this kind of non-Western art. The year later, he's on fire now. And once he's figured out that he can blur the two worlds, the non-Western, the Western, he continues along this line, and it'll ultimately culminate next year in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, where we'll begin next time, considered one of the great paintings of the period. Extraordinary picture. But now, your turn.
Thanks, Matt. So we have a lot of questions from the over 800 people that are tuning into this lecture. So the first question is, and for anyone out there, you can submit a question using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. So Jude wants to know, how long was Picasso affiliated with Gertrude Stein, and did they stay connected during his career?
That's a good question. They were very close in the early years, so 1905 through Picasso's early development. Did they stay close? These are two figures that knew that each other was doing extraordinary work. So Picasso is one that recognized talent in someone else. He certainly does this with Matisse and others, and certainly does this with her. And so there is that connection there. That's a great question. I'm going to give a little snippets because I want to give lots of people opportunity to ask.
So we have several people asking to provide more context about La Vie. Specifically, Adrian wants to know, what do you make of the mother and child on the right? of the lovers.
Yeah, this is great. What do I make of it? So here, let me go off the record because we don't, off the art historical record, we don't know. We're so limited in art history to coming up with conclusions about objects and people based on the data that we have. It's a proper study like any other study. So if we have data, say Picasso commenting on something or maybe not commenting on it, and that becomes revealing, or enough pictorial evidence where it becomes clear what someone is doing, then we can make an assessment. But with that mother and child figure, we don't have a lot of that. So off the record, I think it's no doubt Picasso thinking about his place in life, thinking about life and death. And when you think of life and death, you know, obviously you think of birth, childhood, and so on. So that, in my mind, that mother and child figure, pair of figures at the right there, especially if you can go back to your mind's eye and imagine that, especially the way that he's paired them with the two figures at the left. So you've got the Picasso / Kazagamis figure with Germaine on the left, and then at the right, the mother and child. It becomes very much a poignant study, I think, about, you know, the meditation of life, the brevity of life, birth, death, womb, tomb. It's really quite extraordinary. But that would be my guess. We don't really know.
Fascinating. We have lots of questions about how he made money. So the first question is from Chris. Was Picasso able to easily sell his paintings as he was developing in his career to support himself financially?
A good question. So the Paris picture that I showed you from the very first moment that he arrives there, the one that borrows unapologetically from Toulouse-Lautrec, who's really one of the kingpins of that kind of imagery of the Bohemian underground in Paris, that painting sells right away. It doesn't sell for what Picasso sell for now, but again, that takes us to a whole other issue. That sells right away. Picasso will eventually start to get a name for himself, but not the name that we all know. That doesn't happen until later. Here he's starting to sell, he's starting to get credibility with people in the know, in the avant-garde world, but he won't become the Picasso that we know that commanded exorbitant prices until much later. After his death, obviously the market just went through the roof, and now the prices are extraordinarily high. But in his lifetime, yes, certainly by the mid to the end, he is comfortable and he is selling and he's coveted.
With regards to his father, we have a few people asking for more information about his father. Like, was his father pleased with the direction that Picasso took, or about Picasso's father's work? Was he remembered for any of his work?
I'll take those both. Was he remembered? Not particularly. He's someone that you'll find as a footnote in art history land because of his son, and really, how could he not have been? Picasso was truly just a whole other level. What did he feel about his son? You know, that's a question that keeps coming up over and over in Picasso scholarship. We don't know. This is not something that Picasso talked very much about, but one of the sources, and if you're interested, both the person who asked this question, everybody else here, one of the sources that is verifiable is John Richardson. And John Richardson is someone who knew Picasso and heard the stories over the years, and then finally wrote the definitive accounts of Picasso's life, the biographies of Picasso's life. And so from Richardson, we get a sense that this affected dad more than son. And I don't think that's a stretch. This is something that once Picasso was able to break away, he did. And this is something that affected Picasso, we think, far less than it no doubt affected his father.
And what about his mother? Did he have a strong relationship with his mother? Linda from Boston wants to know.
Linda, great question. In 30 minutes, I want to show you all the masterworks. So there's only so many I can show you at the beginning. But one that I didn't show you, a painting from the early years, is a portrait of Picasso's mother. And he seems to have really taken a lot of time with it. He seems to have really looked at her very carefully. And where you have the anecdotal accounts through Richardson, his friend and biographer, about Picasso and his relationship with his father. And again, a lot of this gets very Freudian very quickly and often deep water. But where you have that with his father, you don't seem to have that with his mother. The portrait is lovely, it's soft. He seems to have been quite connected to her. After all, he took her name too.
Hmm. So, Maureen would like to know, what was the public's response to his paintings when he changed from more realistic images to those from blue and then pink periods?
That's a great question. So when we talk about the public, it's not public in the sense of now. Now you put the name Picasso in any exhibition and you will get extraordinary ticket sales. In the early years, there really isn't much of a public, truly, for him. He's young. He's just come from Spain. It's a place that is on the radar, certainly in Paris, but not really. It's a whole other land far away, right? The School of Paris has got its own major players at that time. And in the early years, if you think of the Blue period, now Casagemas commits suicide February 1901, and this goes on. Picasso's dealing with this legacy through the Blue period, through 04, 05. This is not a moment where there is much of an audience for Picasso. So people who knew him must have responded to his work, but there really isn't much of a public at large, that we can measure how they responded to his works at that point. He's still very much underground during the pink and the blue period. After Demoiselle, that's 07, he will get more critical acclaim and certainly more attention from the artists around him, the avant-garde artists around him in the School of Paris. That wasn't exhibited, that picture, till much later, but it becomes the centerpiece of his mini museum at his own studio. So what did people think? I'm sure they noticed a difference. They probably would have thought how prolific he was. How can you move from classic portraits of a fisherman, tourist images that become much more interesting, much more psychological, to images of Parisian bohemianism, to blue period, dark psychological images about the loss of a best friend and perhaps your involvement in it, right? Picasso knew that his putting his friend on the boat back home was, the beginning of the end for him. A bit of hero worship there from Casagemas to Picasso. So, we don't really have the public at large yet, but it's extraordinary how he's moving so quickly. People would have noticed, but not in the numbers that we think today. That's a great question, Maureen.
Was Picasso religious, and did he do a significant amount of religious art?
That's a good question. Was he religious in adulthood? No. Was he religious in childhood by necessity? Yes. Certainly the first communion picture is, his version of the world at that time. He's young, he's looking at what's around him, but not particularly even then, but later on, much less, no.
What was his relationship to Matisse?
That is a great question. Matisse, some of you may know him, may not. Henri Matisse is a contemporary of Picasso. They met through Gertrude Stein in 1906, which is alone extraordinary. You sort of want to be in that room when one of the great artists of the day meets one of the other great artists of the day. The relationship, this is something that biographers have played with their whole over and over. Exhibitions have been mounted around this, around a kind of frenemy, a kind of love-hate, a rivalry, I suppose, but that sells lots of tickets and it generates lots of interest. But truly, when you look back at the record, Stein and Matisse and Picasso, there doesn't seem to be the level of distrust and animosity that comes out of some of these retrospective narratives that probably are even a little bit anachronistic. We're putting our own spin on this sort of reality TV era spin on it. They each knew, I will say this, that the other painter was the one to watch. Picasso is not looking as closely in Paris at the work of anyone else. He's studying objects from the Louvre. Very famously, he borrows the pose and the tone and the monumentality of the body of the portrait of Stein from an Ingres portrait hanging at the Louvre. So he's looking everywhere. He's borrowing the composition of the evocation, the burial of Kazagamis. Do you remember that picture where Kazagamis is dead at the bottom, and then his soul sort of rises up to meet the three graces at the top? That was based on a painting by El Greco. So he's certainly looking at other painters and artists, and he will do this throughout his entire career. And in terms of living artists, Matisse was the one he primarily looked at. One more thing to say about the Matisse-Picasso thing is that both believed they were the sole inheritor of not only the style of Paul Cézanne, the French painter who just died when, right at the time Picasso and Matisse got to know each other, but his work as well. They each in their own way recognized that Cézanne's contribution was extraordinary, and they each felt in their own way that they could pull the game forward. Matisse felt that Cézanne played with what's real and what's not real, right? A painting's not real. It's a fake of reality. But with Cézanne, you don't know what's real and what's a fake. Where there's a mountain, that's real, but then the way he's painted it looks fake. So that sort of 50-50, that sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out thing that Cézanne was working with, playing with, say, reality and artifice. This is something that Matisse just runs with. And some of the great pictures by Matisse show that. Objects in the studio that seem out of the imagination, but yet there's enough of the real world that makes it palpable. Matisse does this primarily with colors. Picasso, though he had gone through the blue period and the rose period, he's not as much a colorist as Matisse. And Picasso will use line and form and flatness and so on to continue what he believes is Cézanne's legacy. So those two, Matisse, Picasso, are very much, as you say, joined at the hip at the time and watching each other very, very carefully. We'll see how this plays out next time with Demoiselle, which there is no doubt that is based, at least in part, on some of the nudes that Matisse was doing at that time and some of the imagery around this sort of non-Western figure that Matisse was doing. You could say Picasso was very competitive and was very competitive with Matisse.
So, Matt, that went by really quick. We have time for just one more question, and then we're going to have to save it for the next time. So,
next time. Okay, one more. Let's do it.
This could all be difficult for you, but what is your favorite museum to see Picasso featured in?
What is my favorite museum to see Picasso featured in? There are so many Picassos in extraordinary collections around the world. And when we get back to a different kind of reality, we will, all of us, hopefully put that on our radar and take more and more time to visit all these collections. But I don't think that we can underestimate the importance of, say, the collection at MoMA, Museum of Art in New York. Really, it holds so many fascinating works from the period, including Demoiselle. And in that one place, in that one building, you can then look at a Picasso, and now, of course, Demoiselle is paired with Faith Ringgold. We get all kinds of questions about gender and race. We'll talk about those next time. But in that same building, after you see Picasso's, you run over and look at Matisse's, so you can really compare them. You can do this around the world. The National Gallery in London is an extraordinary place. Out here where I am, SF MoMA is an extraordinary place. There are so many places in the world that have great works. I would say, pound for pound, MoMA is just extraordinary. I mean, that's probably the best.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to the over 800 people that have signed up today. Stay tuned for an invitation to part 2 of Matt's lecture. And Matt, could you give us a quick preview of what you're going to focus on in that lecture 2 weeks from today?
Yes, sir. So part 2 is where Picasso goes from here. If we imagine part 1 is childhood, breaking free of his father, figuring out who he is, going to art school, finally moving to Paris, establishing himself, digging through the post-impressionists like Toulouse-Lautrec, and then on to blue and pink and the African-inspired stuff. Next time we'll pick up there and look at the impact of Demoiselle, not only on Picasso's career, but on the world of art at large. And then we'll move on through his analytic cubist work, where he's working right alongside Georges Braque, who is an extraordinary painter before the war and after, but better before the war. He was injured in the war. It sort of affected things. And then from there, we meet a new Picasso. After the First World War, he gets married. He has the first of his 4 children in 1921, Paolo. He just keeps on changing. And through the 20s into the 30s, where he meets, where more of his work is in the vein of the surrealists. And then we meet Guernica in 37 and then onward. He will die in 73. So the corpus is just massive, but we'll pick up the ball and keep running.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. And to everyone out there, we hope you enjoy the lecture today and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.